Put your hands behind your back, Ronald.
Yes, sir.
It started quietly in Florida. Deputies approached a man who had been out of sight for just over a week. His name, Ronald Exantis. A name that still sends chills through anyone who remembers what happened to 6-year-old Logan Tipton. Back in 2015, the small community outside Lexington, Kentucky, was shaken when Exantis broke into a family's home in the middle of the night. He crept through the darkness, entered a little boy's room, and stabbed Logan to death as his family slept. It was a crime so violent, so unthinkable, that even the most seasoned officers struggled to comprehend it. During his trial, Exantis claimed he'd had a psychotic break, that he didn't remember what he'd done. The jury believed he was mentally ill, finding him not guilty of murder by reason of insanity. Still, he was sentenced to 20 years for assault. 20 years that the Tipton family believed would at least keep him away from the world. But in 2024, just 10 days before his rearrest, Ronald Exantis walked free. His release came quietly, a result of good behavior credits and procedural loopholes. The news spread fast and the outrage spread even faster. How does someone like that get out? People demanded. Even law enforcement officials couldn't make sense of it. One sheriff said it plainly: focus on getting that small handful of violent criminals off the street, either in the psychiatric institution where they belong or else into prison. Period. Exantis had traveled over 750 miles away, ending up in Ocala, Florida. But there was one thing he failed to do, something that would lead officers straight to him. He didn't register as a felon within 48 hours as the law required. And when deputies finally found him, he was living right next to an elementary school. For the Tipton family, the news was almost too much to bear. They had already survived the worst night imaginable. Coral, Logan's sister, still remembers that night vividly, the screams, the confusion, and the image of her little brother's final moments. Their father, Dean, recalls holding Logan in his arms as the boy took his last breath. He closed his eyes, and he was gone. Now, nearly a decade later, Logan would have been 16. A teenager, full of life, probably learning to drive, hanging out with friends, maybe getting ready for college. His father says quietly, just a hug would be nice right now from him. Knowing that Ronald Exantis is back in custody offers the family a small piece of peace, but no amount of justice can fill the emptiness left behind. Still, one question remains for everyone who hears this story. When someone capable of that kind of violence is released into the world again, who's really being protected? The sun had barely risen over Ocala, Florida, when deputies moved in. A man who once made national headlines was standing in front of them, calm, quiet, and wearing the same expression he had during his trial years earlier. Put your hands behind your back. He obeyed without resistance. No fight. No words. Just silence. For the officers, it was a simple arrest. But for the people who remembered his name, for the Tipton family, it was everything. Word spread fast. Within hours, every major outlet had the same headline: convicted child killer rearrested in Florida. Across the country, outrage poured in. How could a man responsible for such a brutal crime walk free after less than a decade behind bars? The more people learned about the details, the angrier they became. Exantis had been released under Kentucky's early release program, a system meant for inmates who showed good behavior. But this wasn't a case of a minor offender. This was a man who had broken into a home and taken the life of a sleeping child. A crime so senseless that even years later, it haunted an entire community. Local officials tried to explain that their hands were tied. The law allowed it, they said. But for many, that answer wasn't enough. In Kentucky, Logan's hometown became a sea of emotion. Candles flickered outside the family's old home. Neighbors left flowers, photos, and drawings of angels, all bearing one message: justice for Logan. Coral, Logan's sister, spoke publicly for the first time since the release. Her voice trembled, but her words were clear. I don't understand how someone who did what he did gets a second chance. My brother doesn't. Dean, Logan's father, stayed quiet for a long time. When he finally spoke, it wasn't anger that came through, it was exhaustion. You do your best to move on, he said. But how do you move on when you see his face on the news again? Meanwhile, investigators began piecing together where Exantis had gone after walking free. Records showed he traveled hundreds of miles, crossing state lines without notifying authorities, a direct violation of his release conditions. Even worse, when they tracked him down, he was living just steps away from a local elementary school. For residents in Ocala, it was a terrifying discovery. Parents pulled their children from after-school programs. Neighborhood watch groups formed overnight. The question hung in the air: How many more like him were out there, quietly blending back into society? Authorities said the arrest was swift and uneventful, but the timing could not have been more critical. If deputies hadn't checked his registration status when they did, he might have continued living freely, undetected. And so began a new round of investigations, not just into Ronald Exantis but into the system that released him. State officials faced intense pressure to review early release policies. Lawmakers called for changes, demanding that violent offenders be permanently restricted from such programs. Still, behind all the headlines and public outrage was a family, one that had already lost more than anyone should. For them, this wasn't about politics or laws. It was about a little boy who should still be here. Dean Tipton later said he didn't feel joy when he heard about the arrest. He felt relief, but also sadness. Relief that Exantis was finally back in custody. Sadness that it took national outrage to make it happen. As the story grew, so did the questions. How had no one noticed he was missing from the registry? Why wasn't he under closer supervision? And perhaps the hardest question of all, what would have happened if he hadn't been caught when he was? For investigators, the focus was now clear: prevent this from happening again. But for the Tipton family, the focus remained the same: keeping Logan's memory alive. They spoke about him often. About how he loved superheroes. How he never went anywhere without his favorite toy truck. How, even as a little boy, he always wanted to make people laugh. He was 6 years old. Innocent. Trusting. And gone too soon. Now, as Ronald Exantis sits behind bars once again, many hope it's for the last time. But trust in the system has been shaken, and some fears don't fade easily. Because when a man who took a child's life can walk free, even for 10 days, people begin to wonder what justice really means. And as this story unfolds, one truth remains. For the Tiptons, there will never truly be closure, only the hope that no other family will have to live this nightmare again. The arrest of Ronald Exantis didn't just make headlines, it ignited a storm. Across the nation, people weren't just talking about the crime anymore. They were talking about how the system had let it happen. Kentucky officials were suddenly under the spotlight. Calls poured in to the Department of Corrections, to the governor's office, and even to lawmakers who had supported early release programs in the past. Everyone wanted answers. How did a convicted killer, a man found guilty of brutally stabbing a child, manage to walk out of prison after less than 10 years? The explanation sounded simple on paper: good behavior credits. But the reality was far from simple. Under Kentucky law, inmates can earn credit days for following rules, working prison jobs, or completing rehabilitation programs. Those credits shorten their sentences automatically. It's meant to reward rehabilitation, but no one expected it to apply to someone like Ronald Exantis. When reporters pressed for details, corrections officials admitted the rule didn't separate violent offenders from non-violent ones. In other words, even those convicted of horrific crimes could qualify for early release if they maintained good behavior inside prison walls. That revelation sent shockwaves through the public. Talk shows, newspapers, and online forums lit up overnight. Some called it a legal failure. Others called it a betrayal. In one interview, a Kentucky lawmaker admitted, "We've created a system that rewards behavior on the inside, while forgetting the damage done on the outside." Meanwhile, in Florida, the sheriff who led the arrest spoke out. Standing before reporters, he said calmly, "This man didn't just break a law. He broke trust. Trust that the justice system would keep people safe." As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing detail came to light. Exantis hadn't just moved to Florida quietly, he'd applied for housing through a community program that didn't run background checks for violent felonies. That's how he ended up living near an elementary school without anyone noticing. When that news broke, parents in Ocala demanded accountability. Community meetings filled to capacity. Mothers spoke through tears. One woman stood up and said, "If someone like him can move in next to my children and nobody knows, what chance do any of us have?" The outrage reached beyond state borders. Advocacy groups for victims' families began pushing for reform, calling for mandatory lifetime supervision for anyone convicted of child homicide, regardless of mental health pleas or good behavior credits. But even as the country debated, the Tipton family stayed quiet. They had said what needed to be said. Nothing could bring Logan back. Nothing could undo the pain of that night or the years that followed. Coral spent time away from interviews, focusing on her own healing. Dean returned to work but admitted every time he saw news about the case, it felt like ripping open an old wound. He once said, "The first time they told me he was out, I couldn't breathe. The second time when I heard he was caught, I could finally take a breath again, but it still hurt." For law enforcement officers, the arrest marked a rare moment of victory, but also frustration. They knew they'd done their part, but the system had made it far too easy for someone like Exantis to disappear in the first place. A senior investigator summed it up best. The justice system is supposed to protect the innocent. Somewhere along the way, it started protecting those who break it. As weeks passed, more questions surfaced. Documents revealed that Exantis had received positive evaluations during his time in psychiatric treatment. Reports described him as calm, cooperative, and responsive. But none of those reports could measure what he might do if released. One psychiatrist who reviewed the case years later said bluntly, "You can't treat what you don't understand, and you can't predict what someone like that will do once they're free." The deeper investigators went, the clearer it became that this wasn't just one man's story. It was a reflection of a system cracking under its own rules, where paperwork, technicalities, and time credits outweighed common sense and public safety. In the following weeks, Kentucky lawmakers announced an emergency review of their early release policies. There were talks of rewriting the rules, separating violent offenders from the program entirely. But for many it felt too late. The damage was already done. A little boy was gone. His family forever changed. And a community left wondering what it would take to truly keep people safe. As one reporter said on air, justice isn't supposed to be about chances, it's supposed to be about accountability. And this time, accountability came 10 days too late. For now, Ronald Exantis sits in a Florida jail, waiting for transfer and new charges related to his failure to register as a felon. It's a small comfort but a necessary one. Because no matter how calm he seemed in those arrest videos, the world hasn't forgotten who he is or what he did. And as the investigation continues, one question hangs heavy in the air: how many more are out there walking free, hidden behind the word rehabilitated? Days turned into weeks, but the shock never faded. Across America, the story of Ronald Exantis became more than just a headline. It became a mirror reflecting how fragile justice can be. News stations replayed the footage of his arrest again and again. Viewers watched in disbelief as the man who once terrorized a sleeping family stood quietly in handcuffs. The same man who took the life of 6-year-old Logan Tipton was once again behind bars, and this time people were demanding he stay there. Everywhere you looked, people were asking the same question. How did the system fail so badly? In Kentucky, lawmakers scrambled to repair the damage. Committees met behind closed doors, drafting emergency bills that would close the loopholes that let violent offenders qualify for early release. It was called Logan's Law by the press, a symbolic name meant to remind everyone why this fight mattered. But laws take time and pain doesn't wait. For the Tipton family, the national attention brought both comfort and heartbreak. They appreciated the support, the letters, the prayers, the strangers who left candles and cards, but it also brought every memory back. Every interview meant reliving the night they lost Logan. Dean Tipton said it best in one interview. "You move through life thinking time will make it easier, but time only teaches you how to carry it." Coral, now older, stronger, spoke at a vigil held for her brother. Her words cut through the crowd. "My brother didn't get a second chance," she said. "So why should the man who killed him?" Her speech was short, but it carried weight. It became one of the most shared clips online. A moment that reminded people that behind every headline, there's a family still fighting to heal. In Ocala, Florida, the neighborhood where Exantis had been living struggled with its own fears. Parents held nightly meetings. Schools reviewed their safety policies. The thought of a convicted killer living steps away from classrooms had left scars that wouldn't fade quickly. One resident told reporters, "You think you know your neighborhood until you don't." Back in Kentucky, Logan's classmates, now teenagers, gathered at the small cemetery where he was buried. They brought balloons and flowers, talking about what he might be like today. Some remembered his laugh. Others remembered how he'd share his snacks at lunch. He would have been 16 now. Driving, joking, maybe planning his future. Instead, his grave was covered in fresh roses left by people who never wanted him to be forgotten. The story of Ronald Exantis became a warning. A warning to lawmakers about the dangers of leniency, and a reminder that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about protection. Experts debated the meaning of rehabilitation. Could someone like him ever truly change? Some said yes. Others said no. But for families like the Tiptons, those arguments didn't matter. What mattered was keeping others safe from going through the same pain. Months later, the final ruling came in. Ronald Exantis would remain in custody, facing new charges for failing to register as a felon and violating his release conditions. This time there would be no early release, no shortcuts, no second chances. As the story faded from national headlines, its impact stayed behind. Kentucky moved forward with reforms. Logan's Law gained support. And across the country, people started paying closer attention to who gets released, and why. For the Tipton family, life slowly returned to something close to normal. There were still hard days, still moments when grief came back stronger than ever. But they also found strength in the love they had for Logan, and in the hope that his story might save someone else. Dean often visited his son's grave quietly, without cameras or reporters. Sometimes he'd sit for hours, talking softly to the headstone. He once told a friend, "You never stop being a father. You just start protecting your child in different ways." And maybe that's what this story really is, not just about crime or justice but about love, loss, and the lengths people go to keep memories alive. As the sun sets on Logan's story, there's a bittersweet peace in knowing his name led to change. A little boy's life became the reason lawmakers acted, the reason policies shifted, the reason strangers stood up and said, "This can't happen again." Because in the end, justice isn't just what happens in courtrooms. It's what happens in the hearts of people who refuse to forget. And while Ronald Exantis sits behind bars once more, the legacy of his crime is no longer just about what he took, it's about what the world learned from it. For Logan, that's where the story ends. Not with fear. Not with anger. But with a promise. That his name will stand as a reminder that one child's life can change everything. And now the question turns to you watching this. Do you believe someone like Ronald Exantis, a man who took the life of a child, deserves another chance at freedom? Or should justice mean never allowing that door to open again? Let us know what you think in the comments below. Your thoughts matter, and they help keep stories like Logan's alive. This is a true story, one that reminds us that justice isn't just about punishment, it's about protection. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more true life stories that reveal the moments the world can't forget.